Hello, and thanks for joining me today with the People's Planning Academy to talk about local history. I'm Jordan Ryan, an architectural historian and archivist who specializes in researching Indianapolis buildings, neighborhoods, land use. Today, we are going to discuss how to research historic buildings and neighborhoods. And I hope that you take away from this that the historic context of a lot of these places is really necessary for understanding how we got here as a city. Understanding this history is the foundation to many of the future modules in this planning academy. I'm going to assume that there is a wide range of expertise on this topic and try to cover a variety of resources. If you have any specific questions, write them down. I will be available during the live session for this module. So how to conduct research. There's a few different ways to start. You may be starting with an address of a place you're interested in. Maybe you're starting with the name of an individual or a business. Perhaps you found a random photograph in a scrapbook. No matter how you begin, remember that there is not one set way to do this research. It really depends on what you're starting with, what you're hoping to find, what materials are available, and how much time you have. So let's start with an address. Starting with an address. There's a lot of different places to look. Here's a list of the first few sources I recommend. Fire insurance maps, known as Sanborn and base maps, can provide details on land changes over time, construction dates, additions, demolitions, and so on. City directories can tell you what a structure's purpose was and who occupied the building. Newspapers can provide advertisements, building permits, things like that. And in some cases, construction details. So this newspaper article I have on the slide is a 19 teens construction article for one of my favorite buildings in Fountain Square, the Wosner building. I really got lucky here. I was searching the address. This article came up and it's providing the original floor plan of the building. So this doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen a lot with commercial structures of this era. So this was a really cool find. A few tips for addresses. We have a lot of address changes between the 1880s and 1890s. Mostly it's done by 1898. So there's a good chance if you see a building on the 1887 Sanborn map and the 1898 Sanborn map, the 1898 map will have the original older address written in parentheses. So that's a good thing to keep track of. Depending on the date of construction and what you're looking for, you may be juggling two different addresses to keep track of during your research. Another tip with addresses, street names will also change. So this is due to two main reasons. One being we renamed a lot of our southern states' street names after the Civil War. So some of those will change, particularly in the Mile Square, but also due to small village and town annexations. You can't have two city streets with the same name on two sides of town. So when different areas were annexed, one might get to keep the street name, but others would have to change. You can double check for these street name changes within the Common Council proceeding notes, which are available on the Internet Archive and on Google Books, but you can also typically find them noted in newspaper clippings and sometimes on maps. So just keep that in mind. So speaking of maps, here's just one example of how you can layer different historic maps and aerial photographs of an area to understand land change over time. So this is showing you a section of Bates Hendricks on Southeast Street. It's showing you the 1898 and 1915 Sanborn maps there on the left. And on the right, we have the 1962 and the 1999 aerial photographs. Look at all those residences that were demolished when the street was reconfigured for what is essentially a large asphalt island with a Burger King in the middle. But just, this is a very drastic change to about 2 city blocks. So you can really study these types of changes using maps and aerial photographs. So whether you're starting with a name to locate an address or you're discovering names by researching an address, names are often very successful ways to research different archival collections, newspaper clippings, and so on. So I usually start with the city directories. You can pull the names of all of the occupants, the owners, the renters, the boarders, sometimes proprietors in the case of a business. You can pull all this from the city directories. You can try then taking those names that you get from the city directories and search for them in the newspapers. And that's where you can find all sorts of stories, stuff about events they're involved in, civic clubs, professional details. Obituaries can be very helpful for leads. Um, Names of successful businessmen, politicians, lawyers, those types will sometimes come up in county histories, most of which have been digitized. And of course, if you have the time, doing that extra, really digging into the census data and other genealogical resources can be very fruitful. So here I took the name that was on the building, Wosner Building, and I searched in the newspaper, and that's when I got to Jacob Wosner, who the building is named after. So he constructed this building to be his meat market. So let's talk about where things get tricky. Maybe you don't have a name, maybe you don't have a location, maybe you're starting with an unidentified photo. This is my favorite thing to do. So I love these mysteries. A few quick tips. One, if you take a photo or scan your unidentified photograph and put it into Google reverse image lookup, sometimes you'll find that it was part already of an online archival collection. Sometimes you might see a photographer's name or a photography studio sort of embossed in the corner of a photograph. Searching for those studios can usually yield digitized collections for pretty successful commercial photographers, or at least you might be able to find typically like a newspaper clipping about the studio and what kind of locations they work in. So that could clue you into neighborhoods or areas of town. But otherwise, you might be starting from scratch. So when you're starting from scratch, I call this reading the building, reading the surroundings. And what I mean is studying visual clues and interpreting information. You're sort of deducing a lot of information here. So you might ask yourself, what does the architecture look like? From the style or the construction of the building, can you assume the location? Can you assume a construction date? What is the setback or spacing of the lot? Narrow setbacks and smaller lots tend to mean older areas closer to downtown. What are the sizes or styles or massing of the house? Have you seen something similar in a neighborhood? Could a house be nearby, something that you recognize? Also, you need to read the surroundings. Are there women walking on the sidewalk in the photograph? Like, what are they wearing? How are they dressed? Is there a car parked out front, or is it, a horse and carriage? You can also look at the landscape and the geography. I'm thinking about a dense tree canopy or really old, robust trees versus, not that much of a tree canopy. Can you see a farm in the background or fields? Is there a stream in the background? All of these are clues. So for example, reading my favorite building, the Wosner Building, this is sort of how my thought process would work. Walking myself through reading this building. This building is very close to the sidewalk. It's basically on the sidewalk. There is no setback here. So you know that it's older, or at least on a commercial thoroughfare that was platted very early on. Stylistically, this building is very interesting. Look at the heavy brick facade. It's an older commercial style, But those glass blocks in those windows, those are an interesting touch. They're not quite an Art Deco glass block that we really know of from the 1920s. This is smaller, it's a little bit more decorative. It's interesting. It's probably safe to assume that it's pre-1920s glass block, you know? Yet for a commercial building, this is actually pretty quaint. You know, there's no detailed terracotta or stone carvings. It's pretty simple. So we could deduce that, you know, it's probably not in the mile square downtown area. Also, if you look at the picture on the right, that weird bump out in the top, you know, that's interesting. And then if you look at the side of the building, this side would have been hidden by a building next to it that's long gone. So they have wood siding up instead of more brick, which shows that it was probably constructed modestly. They're probably trying to save some money, but it's also modest in scale. You know, this is only a two-story structure, which tells you it's probably not in certain commercial thoroughfares that have mostly 3 to 4 story commercial buildings. You know, think about Mass Ave or Washington Street. Those typically are a little bit taller. So, you know, we're modest, we're pre-Art Deco, we don't have any setbacks. This makes a lot of sense for Fountain Square, right? So if you're having trouble thinking about style and planning and things like that, you know, materials, construction, I would really recommend checking out Virginia McAllister's book, A Field Guide to American Houses. It's a really good source to start with to learn more about these kind of clues. So where do you go to find sources? Again, remember, there's not one formula for doing this kind of work. But the first place I'd recommend looking at is the Indiana Landmarks Historic House Research Guide. It will walk you through all kinds of resources, and I wrote a lot of the new version, so you can ask me about specific resources in our session if you have any questions. So we're lucky in that we have a lot of archives and libraries in town. Here are a few of my favorite resources by institution, starting with the Indiana State Library. On the next few slides, I will highlight in orange some of my favorite places to start. The State Library has some resources you have to see in person that I have on that first bullet point, but everything else you can view online. Specifically, the Hoosier State Chronicles digitized newspaper collection is very helpful and includes multiple Indianapolis titles. Most are long gone, but it does include the Indianapolis Recorder, which is very helpful. The next institution is IUPUI, the University Library. IUPUI's digital collections are great sources for maps, plat books, and architectural photo documentation. If you're looking for historic buildings downtown, I'd highly recommend checking out the IHPC slide collection and the Central Canal and IUPUI image collection. Also, IUPUI has digitized many of these early Indianapolis history booklets. It's a great place to grab some stats, look at city boundaries, look at, you know, newly constructed buildings. It's a great starting point. A few other sources with different institutions in town. Keep in mind that the University of Indianapolis has the Mayoral Archive. You might find some stuff in there. The Indianapolis Public Library has some digital collections related to neighborhoods, as does the Indiana Historical Society. I worked for about 2 years on the Indianapolis Bicentennial Digital Collection. I'd highly recommend checking that out, particularly for the Department of Metropolitan Development collection, which was recently put online. Additionally, the Indiana State Archives has been putting more stuff up in their digital collections in recent years. So some other resources, other places for digital collections. The main place I go to is the Internet Archive. They have digitized and provided text searchable versions of the Indianapolis city directories, numerous county histories, some different Indianapolis history books, and the Common Council meeting notes, and really so much more. It's a great place to start, and so much of it is text searchable. HathiTrust and Google Books are also great places that will have similar kind of content, but occasionally you'll have to look at Hathy, Google Books, and Internet Archive, and you might only find a full version of something within one of the three options. And then Indiana Memory is a great place to check that pulls content from multiple different library collections. So just in case you miss something, it's always a good chance to go to Indiana Memory to just double check what you've been searching. And then if you're looking for more photographs, there's plenty of collections online, including the Indiana Album, What Was There, and History Pin. If you're interested in a house that happens to be in an IHPC, that's the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission's district, there's a good chance that you may find a historic image of a house in one of the IHPC plans. So now let's dive into some useful databases. One of the first places I like to start is at MapIndy, which we will run through during our live activity for our module. Just for some background information, MapIndy is a GIS program hosted by the city of Indianapolis that visually layers a Google map with all sorts of data compiled from our city assessor's office, surveyor's office, and many other departments. So what's great about MapIndy is that they've compiled all of these historic Sanborn and base maps, like I showed you earlier, along with historic all the way up to this year's aerial photography. So you can actually toggle back and forth between all these maps, like I've shown you the screenshot on the right, in a place that you're interested in, and to sort of scroll through all of these historic maps and historic aerials up to like the 2020 aerial, and you can really look at use and change over time. You know, you can study when buildings are constructed, altered, demolished, when whole streets and blocks get reconfigured. It's a really, really great tool. And I encourage you to play around with it before our activity. Another useful database that we will also discuss in our live session is Savvy, which is part of the Polis Center's Indy Vitals data repository. So it can be really helpful to understand the demographic data of an area and compare it to historic records like different municipal records, census data, and so on when studying a neighborhood or an intersection. The best way to access contemporary Indianapolis demographic data is through Savvy. So using the Indy Vitals neighborhood option as your boundary option, you can create neighborhood profiles and see all sorts of data related to populations. So here is a screenshot of sort of that base map, and you would go to choose a boundary, scroll through the different boundaries to the Indy Vitals neighborhood, because those are more traditional neighborhood boundaries that we know of today. And then you would get this sort of generated content on the right, but you can look at it in a few different ways. Again, if you want to click around and play with that beforehand, go for it. We'll talk about it a little bit more in our live class. So now for a little extra credit, let's talk about land patents. The U.S. Department of the Interior's Bureau of Land Management contains General Land Office records, and that's based on our public land survey system. These General Land Office records are scanned from the original federal land patents, which were essentially like an initial transfer of land titles from the federal government to individuals. Based on the legal land description, and what I mean by that is using the section township range measurements, you can get the first individual owner of the land and the time of their purchase. From there, you can track deed transfers, kind of going forward in time, looking at different deed indexes and books within the state library and other county records. So this database is very useful if you want to start a chain of title for a specific parcel or property. It's useful for gathering information about individual landowners. And if you're interested in like white settler history, this is a great place to track early land ownership. This is generally a bit too complicated to do for early mile square Indianapolis boundaries, since that land was cut up and subdivided and subdivided. We call that quartered and quartered and so on. However, if you're interested in an area that is outside of 1840s-ish settled Indianapolis, you should be able to do this and be able to identify the first individual landowner. It's tricky, but I'm going to walk you through how to do it in case you're bored or you're just really interested in looking at original federal land patents. So this is the main page. You want to click on that land patent link. This is going to take you to that page where it shows you how you can search for the document. So it's by type, by location, or by identifier. So I always feel most comfortable doing it by type. So I fill out the location and land description to then get to the owner's name, but you can do it in many different ways. So to get to the location information you need here, first, you can go to location to pull your section township range. So we're always going to be second prime meridian. That's the 2 p.m. here. And then for like the Fountain Square, Old South Side, Bates Hendricks, the Mile Square, Hawville, that's all going to be this township 15 north, range 3 east. That's what this is right here. So once you have those numbers, and then within that, this is divided into 36 sections. And I got a tip for that in a second. So to fill out the documents by type, down here, I'm going to put in your township and range. Don't forget your north, south, east, west, second prime meridian. Usually I leave the section blank because sometimes lately I've been finding that the database gets confused and it won't return results even though there's supposed to be results. So sometimes just leave the section blank, but like generally know the area you're looking for. And you're going to get results. So one tip, if you need help figuring out your section township range, you can always get your latitude and longitude numbers real quick off Google Maps, and then take that to earthpoint.us and it'll convert it into township section range by your latitude, longitude. And I'll drop that link in our chat during our live session. So once you get these records, look at the sections, which are over here. And you may need to divide into smaller sections. That's what I meant earlier by quartered. So you start to see that. Some of these that have like 2 quarterings, and this is a half and a quarter, like that means it's half of the section and then the southeast quarter of that half. So you kind of have to go, it's easier to just draw it out and to sort of have a key. But that's how you get through these sections and then these quarter sections to figure out which individual, typically man, you're looking for. So once you figured out which area you're looking at, you click on the accession number. It's going to give you some more details about, the issuing land office. So this one was Brookville. It might tell you the exact date. You're going to get possibly, total acres, things like that. You can double check your location. And then the second tab up here is what we want, the patent image. So you click on that. And this is pretty cool, right? This official federal document from the Department of the Interior. It's a nice touch, showing you a copy of the actual land patent. Again, this is just like for fun extra credit, but if you want a challenge, I challenge you to try to come up with your whatever house or area you're interested in. If you can find that original land patent, I would be really proud. So circling back to neighborhood and community history. So how do we sort of compile what we have to create a bigger neighborhood or community history? You got to start stitching together individual information, right? So maybe you're looking at, a handful of buildings, of homes, of businesses. Well, if you start to stitch together information on numerous buildings, you'll see these connections, you'll see patterns come up. You might make connections between individuals and families and businesses. You might see the same architects and developers working in the neighborhood. You'll certainly see changes to the landscape, to transportation, to boundaries impact neighborhoods and communities. A few places to get a jump start on neighborhood histories. If a neighborhood has local or national historic protections, you will find an IHPC historic preservation plan or a National Register of Historic Places nomination form, both available online. The Polis Center also has some excellent neighborhood histories already compiled, as does the Encyclopedia of Indianapolis. So to conclude, this was a lot of information to cover for our first module, but I hope that I've given you a wide perspective on the sorts of information, data, and archival collections available to do Indianapolis architectural history. Think about what you're interested in researching and what collections might be the best place to start. And again, I'd recommend looking through that Indiana Landmarks Historic House Research Guide. I've dropped the link again here on this slide. During our live module, we will walk through the activity together where we will explore some of these different databases and collections. And then we will discuss our local history interests and projects, and I'll take questions and we can help sort of troubleshoot if you get stuck. So thank you for your time, and I'll see you soon.